All right, everybody. We are now being recorded. My name is Tamara Thorpe. I am the president of SIETAR Europa, and I'm the team lead for SIETAR Ireland. Some of you know me and some of you don't, but I've been part of the SIETAR network since 2006 when I joined SIETAR USA, and I've been a longtime member of Young SIETAR, which has been one of my sort of favorite ways to engage in our network and our community. For those of you who are members, you're quite aware of who we are and who and what we do. For those of you who are joining this SIETAR event for the first time, welcome and thank you. Our mission is to encourage the development and application of knowledge, values, and skills which enable an effective intercultural and interethnic relations as individuals, groups, and organizations, and at the community level. And this event today is the first of a one-year series that we're kicking off this month, our anti-racism learning series. And we launched this series in part of our response to the killing of George Floyd in May in the United States, but it was also part of an ongoing discussion that the SIETAR Europa board started having earlier this year about addressing racism and where anti-racism work intersected with our work as interculturalists, and where within our own organization can we do better to create a more diverse and inclusive community within our network and within the intercultural field. And so earlier in June, we released a statement stating our position on racism and discrimination as it stands in Europe and globally. And in that, we also made some commitments to action. And this learning series fulfills our first commitment to action, which is to educate ourselves and our members on the intersectionality between anti-racism and intercultural work. I think that there are lots of us within our community that have already begun to see and work with the intersectionality, and for some of us, it's new. And so this is really an opportunity for us to better understand that. Another part of our commitment to action was to join other organizations that are taking the lead in the anti-racism movement in Europe. And that's why we have invited Juliana Wahlgren today as part of our panel. I'm very happy to introduce Juliana Santos Wahlgren. Let me put on my glasses so I can read. Juliana coordinates the European Network Against Racism's advocacy strategy in the field of anti-racism and anti-discrimination at both EU and member states levels. She's extensively covered issues related to migration, integration, strategic litigation, and national action plans against discrimination. She's an expert in the different intersections of structural and institutional discrimination with race, gender, and migrant status, LGBTI, and other minorities, legal frameworks, and policies. With strong expertise on gender-based violence, Juliana also provides as a volunteer legal support to victims of domestic violence across Europe. Previously, she's worked as a lawyer at Companhia Brasileira de Petróleo, Imprainha, and as a solicitor at ASTI in Luxembourg. She's the founder of Revira, the European support network for Brazilian and Latino women victims of domestic violence, and she's based in Brussels, Belgium, and her title is Senior Advocacy Officer at ENAR. So welcome, Juliana. Thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Josephine Apraku, who I have been fortunate enough to know and learn from and learn with. Josephine is a scholar in African Studies. She's also been working as a lecturer at both the Alice Salomon University in Berlin since 2015 and at the Center for Transdisciplinary Gender Studies at Humboldt University in Berlin since 2016. Additionally, she jointly manages the Berlin-based Institute for Non-Discriminatory Education with Joel Bonkas, and since 2016, she's been managing the educational project Here and Now, Colonial Racism in the Classroom at the Anti-Racist Intercultural Information Center. So thank you and welcome, Josie. We're so glad that you're here. Our next panelist is Farzana Nayani, and we met many years ago at a SIETAR event. And I am so grateful that we have been friends and colleagues and continue to be able to work together and to have you here as a guest. Farzana is a recognized diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, coach, and international keynote speaker. She's worked with Fortune 500 corporations, public agencies, higher education institutions, school districts, and nonprofit organizations as a consultant and trainer on DEI, intercultural communications, supplier diversity, race, unconscious bias, and employee engagement. Her advocacy work with the employee resource groups, small business advocacy, and entrepreneurship has taken her engagement across North America, from the White House to Silicon Valley. Farzana's expertise has been featured in media outlets such as Forbes, Diversity Inc., NPR, The Washington Post, and LA Times, and in work with the Smithsonian and East West Center. She's based in Los Angeles, California, with a global upbringing including ties to South and Southeast Asia and Canada, and is a published author on organizational training and culture. She's a multi-ethnic Filipinx Pakistani background and is a passionate advocate for the multiracial community, is a parent, and has recently published a new book, Raising Multiracial Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World. So welcome, Farzana, and happy Canada Day to you. Our fourth panelist is Kelly Mcleod Shingen. She is not on camera. She will be joining us in a bit. As many of you know, she is another high demand person, so she is on her way. But Kelly brings an extensive background and stellar track record in diversity and inclusion work, specializing in storytelling and healing racism. She's facilitated cultural competence workshops, trainings, and dramatic presentations since 1989 for corporate, educational, nonprofit, and government institutions in the USA and internationally. She's the past president of SIETAR USA, the founder and artistic director of World Stage, and president of KMS Intercultural Consulting. She's a professional mediator certified by the state of Texas. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in communication from Aurora University and a Master of Arts in Cross-Cultural Studies from the University of Houston Clear Lake. So we welcome all of you. I think people are very excited to start this dialogue. So I want to not waste any more time and start with Juliana. And Juliana, I'm just wondering if you could tell us more about ENAR and its anti-racism work.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Tamara, for the invitation. Very happy to be here with Josephine and with Farzana. My name is Juliana. I work at the European Network Against Racism. So what is the European Network Against Racism? We are a network of civil society organizations based in the 27 member states of the Union, also in the UK, Iceland, Turkey, and Macedonia. And what we do is try to bring more visibility to racial equality and racial justice. So we cover our work with research. So we are evidence-based, we use an evidence-based model of advocacy, community trust, community building, updating is upskilling our membership, but also putting in the political agenda the questions that touch minorities. So we're trying to bring to the core of the discussions the inequalities that touch the most vulnerable amongst the most vulnerable, which are the racialized minorities in Europe that we call the Roma and Muslims, Jews, people of African descent, and migrant. And therefore, we try to understand different manifestations of racism, such as anti-Gypsyism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Afrophobia, and anti-migrant racism. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
And thank you so much. And can you tell us what has been the impact of COVID-19 on racialized communities and the communities that the ENA serve and represent in Europe?
So when we started this, when the COVID started, as we work with evidence to map our actions, we had one doubt. We worked under the assumption that probably COVID would exacerbate inequalities, that COVID would be a window for more structural barriers in terms of access to health, to housing, and other services and rights. So what we did is that we collected evidence of cases of racialized minorities living in Europe that have their fundamental rights violated during the pandemic, and to understand how these rights were violated. So we have a kind of sectorial approach. We're trying to understand how COVID was impacting them in the field of labor market, housing, health, but also how the manifestations were being exacerbated, like hate speech, hate crime, and of course, police brutality. And then it was unfortunate to see that the elements of this research, they kind of were a portrait of the same kind of violence that we see in the US. So the George Floyd incident, assassination, murder, just proved that there is a lack of information of racism in Europe because people still map it as a problem from the US, as an external problem, as a problem that is isolated from another continent, and there is a denial of the racial inequalities in Europe, and especially the structural barriers. So what we saw, just to give like some kind of key findings, for example, that in housing, we have either a problem of lack of accommodation or overpopulation in centers, like the case of migrants, or the lack of alternative housing, like was the case of Roma. In the case of the labor market, we saw that those who were the caregivers were mostly people of color, and those who have no access to health were also people of color. In the field of police violence, again, we are over-policed and underprotected. So how police abuse was formalized via the extension of the legislations and the frameworks that were implemented during COVID time due to security measures. So they could control even more the black body, the brown body, the person of color body. So there was a huge dimension on over-policing of these minorities during the COVID. So it was a way to showcase how the structural barriers that were already there, they were even exacerbated after the COVID. But for us, it was a good opportunity to showcase it in a very clear way, to say this is not isolated problem. This is a problem that exists. It's a remaining problem that is being reported with evidence and analysis over the years. Since 20 years we've been doing that, but nobody took the chance to really think that was a problem with that. So now it seems to be the priority of the EU, which we think is a good window of opportunity, but what we see is a lot of lip service. What we see is, again, we are talking about racial equality without the people that are touched by racism in the center of discussions. If you see how these discussions and decisions like the recovery plan and the decisions from the College of the Commissioners, it's still being doing by the represented elected, which are white people and mostly men. So that's where we stand in the times of COVID, but we are hopeful. I think that we are a pivotal moment in history. Yeah. And I think we have the opportunity to shift these discussions, if we bring race to the core of the discussions again, with the racialized people involved.
Yeah, thank you so much, Juliana. I think that's some really important takeaways that since the COVID-19 and that we have sort of seen this, as you said, a showcase or highlight on those inequities that has created an opportunity for learning and growth and action. So thank you for all that work that you all have done. And I think that kind of information and tangible information about what's happening in European countries is so valuable. Josie, can you tell us a little bit about your work in non-discriminatory education and what you have seen in your community? No.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Well, where do I begin? So let me start first by talking a little bit about what it is that I do on a daily basis. So we have founded the Institute for Anti-Discriminatory Education about 7 years ago, and we did that because we felt that there was a huge gap in Germany specifically regarding anti-discriminatory education. So there have been quite a few organizations which are funded that do this kind of work, which I think is important, but I feel that there is a huge problem with that. This kind of work will only be funded if people think, for example, that racism, systemic racism specifically, is an issue, if sexism is an issue, and so forth. And we felt that we needed a space, or we needed a kind of organization that does that work on a daily basis without necessarily having to be funded. So this is basically why we started about 7 years ago. And what we do on a daily basis would be things like organizational development. We help different organizations with regards to change processes, looking at systemic racism within the organization we're working with. For example, we write teaching materials and give lectures, and all the time what we try to do is we try to be really flexible, because what we see is that depending on the organization we're working with, and that could be, for example, a museum, that could be a theater, that could be all kinds of organizations that, for example, sell clothing or whatever they do, we always try to be as flexible as we can be, because we have realized pretty quickly that I think one of the biggest problems is how do we kind of go about the change process. So sometimes, for example, we have teams where you can see that there are quite a few people who are really interested in creating change with regards to racism, for example, and also setting the tone for a clear anti-racist agenda within the organization. So sometimes we have whole teams that are interested in doing this kind of work, but also most of the time we do have teams, for example, that will say things like, we don't have a problem with racism, everyone we work with is white, just to give an example. So those are like the typical things we have to deal with on a daily basis, just in a nutshell, basically. I can only agree with Juliana, because I feel that COVID, and I think that is not specific to Germany, has really kind of shown how unjust society really is. Not necessarily in the first place, I feel like, with regards to racism, but I feel like especially now there is a highlight on racism as well. I think more and more people, at least that's how I felt in the past few months and weeks, are really interested in understanding how and in what ways our society is unjust, and also finding ways to change that, not necessarily on a big level, I feel like, but also, you know, in an interpersonal level, which I think, you know, is an important step to take in the first place. So I feel like there's a huge highlight on social justice in general. And I think there's a huge highlight, especially the past 3 weeks, for example, on racism specifically. And that is something I feel very strongly about at this particular moment, because I can see that there are so many people asking us to support them with their organizations, for example. I have given so many interviews in the past weeks with regards to systemic racism in Germany. And I feel that one of the biggest difference in this past weeks has been, I didn't have to discuss if racism is systemic. So I wasn't posed for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't posed the question, does racism exist in Germany? Which is most of the time how any interview would start. And I think, especially now at this very moment, people seem to be past that step. And we'll see what comes from here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Josie. I think that is the opportunity that the social inequities, the systemic inequities on a global scale have been revealed. And for many who weren't sure or were on the fence about those inequities, have certainly been exposed to a lot of real life situations and information to help them sort of get off the fence and understand that it shows up in all parts of our society and all of our organizations, even organizations like SIETAR, where you have people from all over the world from different backgrounds who have traveled and been exposed. It's still very much a part of our organization because we exist within those social systems where those inequities are. And so part of the learning process is starting where those intersections are. And so Farzana, thank you. And I know that you have your own expertise, and I know that what we have seen as part of COVID-19 is some very specific targeted anti-Asian racism and bigotry happening across the globe. And I'm wondering if you can share with us what has been happening and how communities are responding.
Thank you for putting this together, and greetings to my fellow panelists and everyone who came today. I'm calling in from the land of the Tongva people, the indigenous peoples in Southern California. And it's important to sort of place this in the backdrop of systemic discrimination and oppression against indigenous peoples and Black people around the world. Because when I talk about anti-Asian racism, it's complete honoring of that as well. So I'm not ignoring that. I just want to say that that is a huge part of how this all works together. So anti-Asian racism was on the rise because of the coronavirus being brought to different places, from China specifically and then Asia overall. And what we found was that there is, and there has been, so much violence against people of the Asian community, not just Chinese people, but people who are seen to be perceived as Chinese. So the uptick in racism against Asian people came in the form of vandalizing of businesses. It came in the form of targeted discrimination, being spat on, being stabbed, being shunned from places of business, from transportation, being pushed off subway stations, stuff like that. And the depth of it is that Asians are never seen as being part of a country, except for an Asian country. So for example, the idea of the being a part of the melting pot or assimilating, that can't ever happen fully for Asians, because Asians are seen as a perpetual foreigner. So that compounded with COVID and the idea of Chinese people eating bats and all that stuff that was circulating, that actually compounded into this really forceful racism that permeated throughout the world. And so there are reports of even people in India who were discriminating against Nepali people for looking Asian, that they carried the virus, or you'd see this throughout Europe and so on and so forth. And what that does is it reinforces this idea of the perpetual foreigner, of othering, of exclusion, of a lack of belonging. And the key here is also this other component of racism that came from the idea of the model minority. So this idea of the model minority was a manufactured idea. It came from the structured immigration that came around in the 60s, and people bought into it. They bought into the idea that Asians are smarter or good at math, and et cetera. And people joke about this, but this terrible meme has actually been forceful in not having people see the breadth of Asian Americans, right? There are people who aren't of that nature, just like in any culture. You can't say that a slice of society is one thing, one type of intelligence or one type of economic background. It doesn't make sense. But this thing is permeated through, and because of that, there's been more hate. There's more hate on Asians because people feel that they can bully Asians. They can bully Asians in this time, that they can take it, right? And that they're deserving of it. And it relieves the oppressed feelings that they have. So we're seeing this from other ethnic groups. So the horizontal racism is alive and well and sad, because oppressed groups are finding outlets onto other oppressed groups. which is shameful, but we have to really tie it back into white supremacy and how all of that is a product of this dominant society we're in that values proximity to whiteness and anti-Blackness. So we can't look at any type of this type of racism without calling out how deep and systemic that is, not only in the United States. I grew up in Canada. In Canada, that is the case. We can't say, you know, one country is holier than thou. It is happening there too. There are Black lives that are being taken and killed around the world, just maybe not as documented as the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement is in the United States, I would argue. So part of it is that you know, there are forces that are there, and there are groups that are mobilizing in each of these countries, in Europe, around the world, who are doing this. And this movement that we're in that uplifts the idea that Black Lives Matters, it does actually benefit other racial groups who are now seeing the benefit of, like what Josephine was saying, that we don't have to say that racism exists. Right? We can move the conversation forward finally and look at some of this complexity that's there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Farzana. I think there's so many critical points in what you said, and I think an important thing to note is that this is a global issue, and in each country it exists and manifests in its own context, right? And the kind of comparing doesn't help the dialogue, right? That if we understand that all of the dynamics each of you so far have mentioned exist in every country, then we can start focusing on that individual and group growth that Josie referred to, right? Because sort of having the comparison dialogue is a waste of time, right? That keeps us from moving forward on the dialogue of what is and what can we do. So thank you. So hello, Kelly, and welcome, Kelly. We're glad that you are here. Kelly, for you, you're in the U.S., and can you tell us, since the killing of George Floyd, we know that this has launched a global uprising around anti-Blackness and discrimination, racial discrimination across the globe. And as Farzana said, it's starting to really shine the light on lots of intersectionalities around these issues. Can you share with us what you're seeing and what's happening for you?
Hi, everybody. And again, I want to say, as Farzana so clearly and succinctly said, I am also coming from Native American lands. Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma specifically is where the Trail of Tears ended, so I want to acknowledge that. I am also in the city where the Tulsa Race Massacre happened just at 99 years ago, and most recently was the location of the first rally that the current White House occupants had on the new campaign trail. So we have been a place, and specifically here in Tulsa, where there has been so much racial unrest that's been a part of the soil that we stand on. The impact that I am recognizing, or that I'm beginning to see, like everybody has mentioned so far, is that the conversation of the point of departure to be able to have the conversation about racism is so much further than what it used to be. And it was propelled because of the atrocity that happened to George Floyd and the myriad of people who died leading up to that. This is not new to the United States. It's not new to the globe. This is one of those situations that is serving currently as the catalyst for the work of anti-racism and dismantling systems of racism. People are beginning to see it in a way that they haven't seen it before, and the support that is showing up now is something that we also haven't seen before. The support for Black Lives Matter movement has increased exponentially since the George Floyd murder. And so what we are seeing is that there's a new awakening. People are waking up to this. And what I appreciate is that when I come into an organization as a consultant or to talk about this, is that the conversations the people are ready to have the deep conversation about race. They've been running away from it for decades, really. Let's talk about multiculturalism. Let's talk about diversity and inclusion. Let's talk about unconscious bias. Let's talk about implicit bias. Let's talk about anything but race and racism. And now people are like, no, we want to talk about racism in our organization. And I apologize for being late, but because of the fact that everybody wants to talk about this now, I was just having a conversation about how to have a conversation about race when you're raising children, right? So this is something that Farzana would probably have been all over if she were here in Tulsa. So how do we have these conversations with our kids? How do we give them the tools that they need in order to raise, to be raised in this environment where they can be their full selves and not have to be deeply impacted by the negative results of a system of racism?
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much. And I think that that's such an important point about our everyone's readiness, right? And I think that that in that readiness, part of a lot of what I've seen is I'm ready, but how do I have the conversation? Where do I start, right? So I'm wondering, Juliana, if you can tell us what is anti-racism and how does it differ from other types of work? You know, some of the things that Kelly already mentioned. How does anti-racism, what does it mean and how is it different from what has been done?
I will just unmute and go to another room because there is a whole conversation here at home. Sorry about that. We are adapting with COVID. What is anti-racism different from the others? Well, the problem is, and I think Farzana has said it very well, Josephine, also when she mentions the question that we don't have to explain anymore what is systemic racism. Kelly, when she says that we are super under the demand to talk about it all the time, is that because we never put race in the center of the discussions. There was an enormous politicization of the question of race. There was, even when we are transferring some models like racial equality, racial justice, but even intersectionality to the European context, and of course I'm trying to be specific here in Europe, is that with all these dialogues about what can be said or not said, we come from a point of fragility of white people. So it's not our fragility, it's not our anxiety, it's not the microaggressions that is important, it's the fragility of the other for whom the society is created. And anti-racism is a tool to showcase that if you don't understand that not everybody is treated equally, there is no way that you can have an honest conversation. Anti-racism in Europe as well began as a movement of no racialized people, different from the US, because there are many people who say, why? Because it's so different from the US in Europe. Well, mainly because issues in the US are highly covered by the press, and here in Europe, the press is used to victimize. It's a re-victimization process by the media when they talk about racism. Second of all, you have a strong civil society movement. Here, the civil society movement were led at the beginning of the 70s and the 80s by people that were concerned about racism but not affected by racism. Third, there is a question of data. In Europe, we cannot disaggregate data. There is a divisibility of the situation. And anti-racism movements such ours and other organizations all across Europe, we serve for that. It's important to be a tool to bring more visibility to the situation, but also to understand the multi-dimensions of racism, which in Europe is much individual focused. So all the frameworks, all the policies, all the actions are focused on how one individual discriminates other. And even the question of anti-bias education, diversity policies is still under the frame of the individual. There is a lack of understanding of the multi-dimensions of racism, where structural racism is a factor, institutional racism is a factor, historical racism is a factor. I don't know if you're familiar how people are taught in Europe about colonialists. It's a chapter of history that is totally erased from books. So how can we talk about racism in European context when this, all this approach has been totally denied for centuries? So anti-racism serves for that, because what you want to achieve is really substantial equality. It's not formal equality. And that's here we have a problem with the diversity programs that are just on the individual level. Why? Because if you do not understand that it's not only trying to formalize access to service or access to opportunities, but also ensuring that the result will be the same in the end, the diversity policies, the diversity education, they serve for nothing. They are just lip service to let's say, please the anxiety and sometimes the image of companies. In our organization, I can be honest, all the time that we are approached by companies to talk about diversity, it was after a legal court case in their constituencies. It was never a proactive action. So there is always a demand to work on diversity. There is not original, it's not genuine. So anti-racism stands for that, and I think what Josephine said is very important. You have to have people from the minorities, people from the groups to be there, to be sure that we have to bring these uncomfortable discussions in a more systemic way, because otherwise you're just perpetrating, duplicating structural racism.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that is such a critical point of understanding the historical context, the systemic and institutional context, and the multidimensionality of all of it, as you said, I think is important, and that it isn't just an interpersonal skill, right? That this is something that really needs to happen at really, really core levels. And so I'm wondering, Josie, for you and your work, what does that look like in terms of, you know, your background in intercultural work and now doing non-discrimination work? Where does your intercultural background help or hinder your work in anti-discrimination, non-discrimination education?
Well, I started to give guided tours on German colonialism when I just started studying African studies about 13 to 12 years ago. And it's really interesting for me to see, just to touch upon that a little bit, because I agree with Juliana. Colonialism in Germany especially is not a topic that is talked about often. I think someone in the comments said, well, it's in the German history school books. And it's true, it's starting to become a topic, but I feel like what is really important that we have to keep in mind is it's not necessarily only for it to become a topic, but also we have to have it as a topic from an anti-racist perspective. Otherwise, and that's what happened, or what used to happen, we'll see German history school books talking about the UK, talking about France, talking about everyone else but Germany, which is absurd, especially if you know that Germany used to have the third biggest colonial territory. So that is something that most Germans don't know. They don't even know that Germany used to have colonies or was taking part in the transatlantic slave trade. I think that is really important information, especially because there is a bigger discourse with regards to anti-Semitism. And it's important to understand that anti-Semitism, especially during the Third Reich, didn't just happen from a vacuum, but it started on the basis of colonialism. So many of the ideas we can see during the NS times are ideas that were important during colonialism first. For example, the first German concentration camp wasn't built during the NS times, but it was built in Namibia when Namibia used to be a German colony, for example. And I think those are aspects that we do have to keep in mind, especially in Germany, I think. So I used to start giving those guided tours on German colonialism, which is because there are basically colonial memorials all over Germany, because you have so-called African quarters, for example, that are most of the time labeled. For example, you have street names that are named after German colonialists, for example. So I started doing that, and then I started working with a company that does intercultural trainings, and I realized pretty quickly that I feel that the idea that most of the time I feel is used with regards to, and that might be specific to Germany, but the idea that a culture has something to do with a nation, and if we only understand this specific culture from this specific nation, we'll all get along. I found that to be problematic, and also that was not my experience as a Black woman in Germany. So I knew very early on that the idea of culture, or that different cultures aren't equally valued in society, especially in a white society. So I realized pretty quickly that even though I like the idea of giving trainings and giving workshops and doing this kind of educational work, I realized pretty quickly that I'm much more interested in power dynamics and how they come into play in everyday life, and also obviously in different kinds of work fields. So yeah, I pretty quickly realized that I wanted to do something else, and that I am still interested in giving trainings and being a consultant. But that's why I founded my own company, basically.
Yeah, and I think that that is a really interesting point. When we look at how does, because I remember years and years ago hosting a roundtable at a SIETAR USA conference around what was the difference between intercultural work and diversity and inclusion work. And it was a really vibrant discussion. But I think one of the things that you said that is so important is that in intercultural work, very often there's this idea of equity, and it doesn't recognize the power dynamics that affect different cultural groups. So I'm wondering, Farzana, for you, your work is deeply rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice. But you have also been do intercultural work, and you have in the past been involved with SIETAR. So I'm wondering if you could share for us where you see the intersectionality between anti-racism, DE&I work, and intercultural work.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So the genesis of my work actually started in intercultural work. My degree is in intercultural communication. I went to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and my advisors were Dr. Richard Brislin, who you may know, Dr. Gary Fontaine, and the departed Dr. Paul Pedersen. So I had, the pioneers of the field who were my advisors. I feel very fortunate and grateful. Given that, when I started to do work, what I found was that I couldn't just talk about cultural differences or cross-cultural or intercultural differences. There was the impact of power and privilege and systemic forces that were at play. And so more and more I was being called to explain those dynamics, being a racialized person myself, being a woman of color of two colonized countries, the Philippines and Pakistan. So what I found was that over time, those things just naturally came together. And I did a lot of community work here in the US, and in particular in Los Angeles, helping underrepresented communities with economic development. And so I use my intercultural know-how to explain why, in collective cultures, we rely on like blending circles, that type of feeling of duty to the collective group will help with lending, for example, right? Whereas in predominantly white dominant style Western banking, they may not have that access to these communities. So that's how social justice, DEI, and intercultural work could come together. But what I found was over time, there was also work in the intercultural field to infuse social justice and DEI into that thinking, meaning that you can't just do a global relocation training and not talk about oppressive dynamics in Europe, right? Let's say how Muslims are treated who are from Northern Africa in France, right? You can't just talk about the cultural differences between Turks and Germans without looking at systemically how immigration has been treated to those marginalized groups. So I naturally, I think because of my background, bring that lens, but part of the work is trying to also infuse that into the networks that I've been in that only focus on the cross-cultural differences. And by and large, those textbooks that have been written by, you know, the forefathers, the pioneers, and these instruments, they're created, normed on a white supremacist society. They're created, normed by people who come from that point of view. And so as we see the gatekeepers who are holding onto those things as traditional pure theory, who haven't heard you know, the voices of the marginalized or the minoritized communities, then we are in fact are being complicit in that system. Yeah. So part of my work is modeling what we're trying to do, which is dismantle and unpack systemic oppression and racism. But I've found that that has not come without, you know, its challenges and its knocks. So I think that the type of work that we've been doing, you know, Tamara and I, we met at the SIETAR USA conference in New Jersey. We've been around a while, over decades, right? Doing this work. I was a part of SIETAR BC, a part of SIETAR USA, on the board of SIETAR USA. It's not that we don't have experience in this, but it's really about, is the environment ready for this conversation? And has it been? And what toll has it taken on the people who have tried to bring up this conversation year over year over year with penalty, right? For being that outside voice. And now we're listening. So that is traumatic in itself, I must say. But I do appreciate the time that we're in right now where this movement is pushing it forward.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Farzana. I think that, you know, I think that's one of the points you just made about without penalty, because now everybody's listening, and that is really great. But there have been a lot of us that have been trying to push this forward, this conversation forward for a really long time, particularly within the SIETAR network. And as you said, we've been punished for it, right? We've been denied the opportunity, we've been denied our voice, we've been criticized for it. And that has been painful, both professionally and personally. And I think that I was sharing just with a member here in SIETAR Europa just yesterday, that even a couple of weeks ago when the SIETAR Europa board and met and thought, how do we respond and what do we do? Before I had that conversation, I had to say to myself, what are going to be the pain points for me in having this conversation with the board, and the pain points for the board to lead this conversation with our organization, to be introspective. And because this is not only about the work that we do as interculturalists outside of the organization, but the work that we do as members of an intercultural organization. And so I think that that is such an important point. And Kelly, what Farzana said really resonated with you, and you're a past president of SIETAR. And so I'm wondering for you, a lot of your work is deeply rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but also the intercultural world. Can you share with us how you see that intersecting and what your experience has been?
Thank you so much for giving me a chance to interject on this part, because I gotta say something. My whole relationship with SIETAR USA has been about pushing the envelope around diversity, equity, and inclusion. My very first introduction to the organization was at the Minneapolis conference in 2001, just after the 9/11 tragedy. And I've told the story a million times before, but I have to say that that first SIETAR conference, I was like, I'm done. We're not even talking about what's important here. You know, what I experienced in that conference was, we're talking about privileged women who've had an opportunity to live abroad for a little while as a trailing spouse, and now they come back to this country and they say, oh, I know all about that country. Let me teach these companies about what they have to do to live in these other countries. Their greatest access, you know, to the people and those that were marginalized in those countries were the people who worked in their homes. So it was privilege talking to privilege, and I was like, I'm done. I don't want to have this conversation. So when the very last session of that day was when I had an opportunity to go to a diversity talk. that was given by friends like Jeremy Salomons, Rita Wibbler, Esther Louie, and I can't remember, it was one more person, but that was the session that made me say, maybe I will give this organization a second look. But before that, I wouldn't. And to this day, I do not identify as an interculturalist. I identify as a global diversity and inclusion facilitator. And that language came for me from a joint session that I did with Alan Richter at a SIETAR conference years ago, when we also had that conversation about where does diversity, equity, and inclusion and intercultural intersect. And when we came up with these two intersecting circles in that session, what was the middle was what we called global diversity, because we were working in an environment where we were having conversations about what interculturalists would call domestic diversity, right? And I was like, okay, well, if that's what I'm doing, then that's what I'm doing. So I'm going into these global and these international places and talking about their domestic diversity, right? So, so for me, I was doing international work, but it wasn't intercultural work, right? My master's degree is in cross-cultural studies, so I've got all the theory and all that. So I know the dudes, I know the ones, you know. And yet, that wasn't the material that gave me the most power when I stood in those organizations. It was to talk about social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there were some concepts within the intercultural field that allowed me to be able to bring that conversation into the room with a softness, right? Because sometimes diversity, equity, and inclusion work or social justice work can be with a hammer, right? And it turns people off because we are angry. It is trying to right the wrongs of historical, right? Intercultural work isn't that. Intercultural work is about, frankly, you know, either being a Peace Corps volunteer, going to give your time and service to another country someplace, or, you know, doing business with somebody else in another country, right? So it's not about righting the wrongs of historical injustice, right? So, but like Farzana has mentioned, none of the work that I did could talk about a community, a culture, a company without talking about power dynamics. And in that power dynamic, what is the history of the relationship between those who have and those who do not have, right? What is that hierarchy? And what I knew that was most valuable in those intercultural settings was to be able to lean on then my diversity background. So, and I will have to say, because I'm not one who grew up in the quote intercultural world, it never hurt me to speak my mind because I've never got any work from the intercultural community. And from the intercultural community, it was because they wanted me to come to talk specifically about race, right? And so I didn't worry about any blowback on me for being able to speak my truth or to continue to push the envelope. It impacted me to do the work the way that I do it and grow up in the field or grow up within the community of SIETAR, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't experience any backlash. And I stayed the course, right? Brought some people along in the process, but are we where we should be? Hell no. You know, let's just be honest. No, we're not. But what I'm grateful to is I recognized for a long time that there were some SIETAR or communities, right, that were more ready for the conversation than others were. SIETAR Houston, which is where I started, was more ready for the conversation than SIETAR USA was, right? When I first started within SIETAR USA. SIETAR USA was a little bit more ready for the conversation than, say, I don't know, SIETAR maybe France or something like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think that what we have to recognize is that the readiness is a key component. And where we are now is I think the people are ready to say, okay, what don't I know? What are the gaps that I have in my intercultural knowledge that I could benefit from from the DEI world? And then I'll say one last thing. A few years ago, there was an article written by our current SIETAR USA president, Sandy Fowler. It was a fantastic article about what tools that diversity and inclusion practitioners could benefit from the intercultural field. It was very useful, very valuable. I utilized that in my work. And I think that now we're at a place where there needs to be that article written about what are the DEI tools that are beneficial in the intercultural space. And we need to be able to make room for that as well.
And I hope you will write that article, so feel free. We just put out submissions today for our journal. So for our next journal. So, and I think that's a really crucial point, because I think a couple of points you made. One, I certainly remember my first SIETAR event. I remember feeling a sense of finding my people, of people who had traveled, who were excited about learning about other cultures. And for me, that was really exciting. The sessions were exciting, but I wasn't connecting necessarily and meeting people. I was new, it was a big conference, but I remember being in a session with you, and I remember you taking the time to introduce yourself to me and to spend time with me. And that helped me kind of think, oh, well, maybe this is something, you know, an organization I can spend a bit more time with. And I think that so much for us as an organization, that when we talk about what's a point of entry for people to come into our organization, it's about creating a space where people feel welcomed and they feel that they belong. And that comes not just from our interactions with people, but also in terms of our content, how we present ourselves, what we present, and what we prioritize as important content on our agendas, right? So how much DE&I and social justice content do we have on our Congress schedule, for example? These are things that we have to start to examine. Who are the organizations that we partner with? And I think that one of the things that I also found was that, you know, intercultural concepts and theories really do create a kind of entry point, right? Because as you said, they are softer, right? People like to hear, oh, what do you guys do in France versus what do we do, you know, in our country? And those are really great conversations, but what's happening in France and what's happening in the UK goes beyond, right, that tip of the iceberg superficial culture. It goes really deep, and as stated earlier, it's really, really multi-dimensional. So I love the idea of us looking at and really outlining for interculturalists what are some of the DE&I tools and strategies that they could be applying in their intercultural work. And I know I've already gotten, I don't know how many requests, but they are coming, that companies that have traditionally been doing relocation work without any training about power dynamics and race now want to add that into their relo material. That in and of itself is a point of controversy for DE&I practitioners who've been already doing the work and who are already experts in it. And so who now wants to be experts in things we're already experts in. So we're all now fielding that dynamic within the intercultural field. But for intercultural practitioners who want to develop the work, develop the skills personally and professionally, Juliana, for you, can you tell us where you see education and training fitting into anti-racism and making a difference?
Yes. Before talking about education and training, I'd like to, first of all, thank so much Kelly, Farzana, and Josephine for their previous contributions. I think we're gonna recognize ourselves in each of your speech in a moment from our lifetime. So I see myself in many of these exchanges. I just want to come back to what Kelly brilliantly said about the catch-22 of interculturalism, especially how it's being used in Europe. Because interculturalism in Europe is being used as a tool to bring invisibility to the race discussions, to silence many of the uncomfortable conversations that you want to bring. Culture is a proxy of race, and therefore we are trying to bring another dimension of the personal experience via the cultural angle. So it's a very dangerous, let's say, tool if you are trying to have a more sophisticated approach to racism, understanding these 4 dimensions that I previously said. So I think what is necessary, first of all, about talking about education and training is about a serious internal reflection about what is the DNA of interculturalism today in the different contexts. There is no one size fits all solution. Each context is different. But how can we appropriate back the good things that means to be intercultural and use it properly, and the bad things we have to reshape, we have to tackle, because they are bringing a lot of problems, because we cannot talk about race anymore because we live in an intercultural society. So it's just putting, again, the problem under the rug. But coming about education, I think education starts with a whole review of the decolonization practice and policies in education. It goes beyond only diversity and representation. It goes also how we talk about races, how racism is reshaping biology, in history, in physics, and geography. It's like Josephine said, we are talking about colonialism, but from which perspective? So we think we need to bring more balance to what these concepts really mean from an anti-racist point of view. So bringing the people to analyze the different approaches, the pluralities of this concept, especially in European territory. I think as well, the question of representation is important, but with a good plan of diversity and inclusive measures, as again, not only the opportunities, but also the results, because otherwise you're not creating safe space for people. And I think as well, it's very important that we understand that probably we won't have all the tools to respond to all the questions all the time. So probably it's a time to recreate new tools to address this. And also, I think what is important is to listen more to grassroots organizations working on the ground, like the one from Josephine, from the work from Farzana, the work from Kelly. It's like talking to these people, give your place. The standpoint needs to be the standpoint of the racialized people. So I think if we go from that perspective, there is a big room for improvement. Again, I just want to say that I'm talking from a European perspective. The other regions, they have a different approaches, but it's true that the incorrect use of intersectional approaches in Europe has undermined racial equality, and we need to appropriate it back and recenter racism in the most important discussions that we have in DAI, in education, training, recenter intersectionality, and again, taking care about the identity approaches, because the fragmentation of policy or identities is also a way to undermine racism. So we have to go beyond the identitary approach, understand structural, systemic, historical, institutional racism.
You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much, Juliana. I think those are really important points. And I'm wondering, Josie, if you can just sort of build an add on what Juliana was saying about where the education and training and learning is as we move forward to be more anti-racist in our work and in our lives.
Everywhere. Honestly, I think it's everywhere. I remember, and I was really happy. I have to say that I have to talk about that a little bit. I remember in 2015, I was able to give a guided tour to Angela Davis, and I nearly peed my pants. I remember that. very distinctly, obviously, because someone wrote to me, oh, will you give a tour to Angela Davis? I'm like, funny, someone is called Angela Davis and will do a tour with me, of course. And it was the Angela Davis. But I remember when she was in Berlin, someone asked her, well, I'm going to be working with this organization and I find this organization slightly problematic, but I think, you know, there is space for change. What do you say? Should I work there? And I remember her distinctly saying, of course you should. If you feel that there's a possibility for change, then yes, of course. Because I think, and I personally, I really agree with that. There is room for change everywhere because racism is systemic. You have all the things to do all the time. And I think it's really, at least from my perspective, I think it's really important to recognize that. So there's not, you know, the perfect way to go about it. There's not the perfect organization to go to and do this work with. But I think we have to do this work on a daily basis wherever we go. Even if we're just, you know, sitting at the dinner table talking to, you know, our family, I think it's so important to take whatever opportunity you have and do this kind of work. And it was really funny when Kelly was saying that she was asked about how to raise children in a racialized world. I've been asked that so many times these past few weeks, and people were saying, what do? You talk about racism. I think it's really simple. That's what you do. You talk about it, and you talk about it honestly, and you talk about, you know, your position within racism. Are you a white person? Are you privileged because of racism? And you have to make your position within society part of the conversation, be honest and transparent about it. And I think that is something you can do everywhere you go. With regards to my work specifically, I work with a white German woman, and we do that very strategically because there are things that when we give a workshop, she has to deal with. And there are many things because of that I don't have to deal with. I don't have to deal with white fragility. I don't know what it is to be white in a German society. I don't know. I don't know how it feels like to learn about racism from a white perspective. That is something that she can do. So I can really only encourage white people to be not only allies, but be accomplices and start, you know, talking about what it means for them to be white in a world that is made for white people. So I think, you know, there's something, or there's responsibility we all can take all the time. So, you know, I don't think that there is something, a specific organization we have to go to. And I think it's also okay to recognize that because we have been socialized in a society that is heavily influenced by racism on all levels, everywhere we go, that we will do things that we might think are problematic later. But I think the most important thing, you know, to take away is an action is not an option. So wherever you go, whatever you do, there's something you can do. And I think, you know, I think it's really important to kind of take that responsibility and, you know, basically tattoo it to your forehead.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that's such an important point, that this idea, if we use the word race, if we talk about race, if we call out race, that we're somehow perpetuating the problem that comes with race. And in fact, it's the opposite, right? That we have to call it what it is. We don't, right? I don't love that we have grown up in a racialized world, or I've grown up with a racialized identity, but that is what has happened, and not being able to name it and call it what it is and talk about it prevents the learning from happening. And so talking about it, even if we all make mistakes around it, I think is super important, right? That there are lots of isms that I make a lot of mistakes in talking about them, but I'm having the conversations to learn and do better. I'm wondering, Farzana, for you, because you come from such a strong background in intercultural theory and practice, when it comes to race and discrimination, where are maybe some tools and theories that people already know that can be leveraged into D&I work, or what are some D&I work that really sort of suits to what people are doing in intercultural work?
It is so important to talk about how race and the topic of race and discrimination can be brought into intercultural work. And some of you were asking about my book. So my book is called Raising Multiracial Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World. We were just talking about how to talk to kids. And there are actually a couple chapters where I bring in intercultural theory. So this is a nod to the intercultural work that's been done. I have here the intercultural development continuum, and I tie it to the idea of what I call racial dialogue readiness. So there's a readiness that is needed to actually have the dialogue with children or even with yourself that we often don't look at. And so I feel that sometimes where DEI work can go awry is that we give the same message to everybody in the room, regardless of the identities that are being held in the room. And that can be painful and cause a lot of trauma. Because what people need at every point in the journey is different, and also depending on the identity. I also talk about the conscious cultivation of identity. So it's like a 5-prong approach to how identity is cultivated. And race itself is cultivated. Race is a social construct. Race is not biological. So part of, I think, the pushback around talking about race is this nefarious thing, like we don't understand it, or it's colorism only. We don't look at how there are systemic forces and intercultural underpinnings to race. And so there's such power in dismantling race through an intercultural lens. Now that being said, there's also this idea of intellectualizing everything to the point where we don't get to the actual topic. Like I've been talked to by people using theory about my own personal experiences, right? Be it gender, or be it my race, or be it colonization. Now, I understand that, and come at me with theory, because I've got the degrees, okay? I've got, unfortunately, the privilege that gives me this platform versus someone else who doesn't, and I'm fully aware of that. But what the problem behind that is that when we don't hear the stories, when we are too busy intellectualizing if someone used this word versus that word rather than what they're intending to say, then that's power that is used to weaponize how race is further marginalized, because you're actually not listening to the story. You're using the theory against somebody by words that are exclusionary, by words that are ways to marginalize further, when oral history has been ripped away from a lot of communities, indigenous communities, a lot of other cultural communities. Our lives, our traditions have been ripped away and retold. These stories have been retold in a racist, white supremacist lens. And so we have to do the work. The practice is to do the work, to ask the questions, like what story is not being told? What person's voice is not at the table? What am I missing? What's my blind spot? And I've been doing a lot of work around the somatic experience of this. So I did the Solidarity and Healing series all this month, unpacking how our physical body reacts to when we're challenged. So BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, are in trauma right now. We're being re-traumatized by seeing police brutality and this understanding that race is like a new concept for people. Like, that's traumatizing for us, okay? On the other hand, for white people who are becoming aware of the magnitude of this, there's trauma there too. There's a lot of somatic experience that comes with having to face this, and maybe that you're complicit. And so some of what we need to do is unpack the vibrational aspect of that, so people don't shut down, so the fragility as it surfaces can be managed, so it's not put on people of color to come and forgive. That whole dynamic of right and wrong, or forgive me, I'm sorry, all of those things play into this inability to move forward, because it creates more of a power dynamic, right? Like, I was teaching a youth of color group, and one of the youth of color said that one of his white peers, who's a high school student, asked him if he could use the N-word. And if he gave permission, now this white kid could go around using the N-word. How problematic is that? So again, we need to come back to the actual like reality without theorizing, like, what does that mean? Like, you know, it's like, no, there are people on the street being killed. There are lives that are at risk. There are people that are being raped. Mass incarceration is a huge issue. These things can sometimes get lost in the theorizing. So all I ask is that when someone tells you the gift of their story, if it's a challenge, receive it, because they care about you. If they didn't care about you, they would quite frankly move on and leave you to how you have been. Okay, so we care in that we're here to talk about this. We care that we've been putting the work, maybe, you know, in contact with you, or maybe outside, so you could do your own work. That's a gift too. Leaving space for you to do your own work is also a gift. So I think those are all the things we need to think about in this intersectionality of race discussion, DEI, and intercultural work.
Yeah, thank you, Farzana. I think that is so key, because, you know, I've told the story several times and just shared it with the board. A couple of us on the SIETAR Europa board at the last Congress that we had last year, there was a session to talk about race for interculturalists. And it became a 60-minute session about the term race, right? And it's what it means in different cultures and languages. And it became a 60-minute exercise in weaponizing the term race and avoiding the conversation about race. And it was an extremely emotional and personally and physically painful experience for me to be a participant in that session, right? And so I think that part of what we as a community and within SIETAR is understanding where the work and the theory and the intersections are, but also understanding that part of this intersection is between what we do and who we are and our own stories. And so I'm wondering, Kelly, if you can just kind of touching on what Farzana has said, share with us a little bit about how you see people, interculturalists, moving forward in their own education, training, and work. Or say whatever you need to say.
Because I got a lot I want to say, but I'm going to see if I can just focus and answer your question. So, let me be 100% just real with y'all. I think that this is an opportunity for us to have a really raw conversation about the intercultural field, about those of us who are doing this work and how we're going about doing it. I first want to say that I love the fact that our intercultural colleagues are ready to have this conversation. They want to have this conversation. And I think that that is fantastic, because we have to. My urge to our intercultural colleagues is that they do their work. You cannot have a conversation about race and racism if you haven't done the own work to unpack your own stuff around race, right? Who are you with regards to race? How have you benefited or not benefited around race? What healing have you done to your own body around race, so that when you are in a conversation around race, you are not so incredibly easily triggered as a facilitator and end up doing more damage than good. I have to, in 2000, I chose to get, sorry, it looks like my connection is unstable, but I chose to get my graduate internship with the Center for the Healing of Racism in Houston. When I went to my first session there, you couldn't tell me that I couldn't have facilitated that workshop myself, right? I was just like, I've been doing this since 1989. I got this, you ain't gotta tell me nothing. I'm just going through the motions to get my degree, right? When I got done with that first day, and I cried my eyes out, and I realized how damaged I was and how much damage I did, I knew that I needed to take a step back and do some healing in my own body before I could go forward, right? And some of you guys may be familiar with my story, Anything But Black, but that was part of my journey towards getting to a place of healing, was because I had to own up to the fact that I had internalized a lot of racism in my own body and was doing damage to myself and oftentimes people who look like me. So if that's true for me, and I'm talking about internalized racism, what internalized white supremacy do our colleagues not know is in their body, right? What internalized white supremacy exists within them as they begin to stand in front of a group? And I'll tell you, some of the ways that it's showing up is that these same colleagues are reaching out to me to come and work for them, or they're reaching out to me to come and do a workshop for them under their brand, instead of getting the F out the way and saying, I am not a specialist around issues of race, but I have some colleagues who are. I'm going to give you their contact information and make room for them. That's what it's taught. That's what recognizing your white privilege and making room for people. So our interculturalists need to do that, right? Refer the work while you are doing your work. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get to the point where you are doing this work, but if you know that this is your very first conversation, that you're about to stand in front of a group and have a conversation about race, people are raw. You're gonna have some people in that room who wanna have a real conversation. If you can't manage your own emotions and you can't be there for them in the room to keep them safe and to make sure that the conversation that everybody is having is one that will propel this movement forward, right? So I think that that's what's happening. Will people do it? Probably not, because I also am fully aware of the fact that we have a lot of egos in this field, and everybody has to be an expert in the thing that they're standing in front of the group for. So I'm just saying, these are hard truths that we have to say. And I love my intercultural family, but you know, if you're my family and if you're my real friend, then let me tell you some things that you need to hear versus the things that you want to hear.
Yeah, and I think that is, there's two parts to that, right? There's the what we need to do our own work and our own healing around what's coming up for all of us in these times and what has been part of our stories and journeys for so long. And then also recognizing what our capacity is within doing the work professionally, right? That I think, you know, part of the reason that, you know, when diversity and inclusion work kicked off in the early years, part of the reason that it wasn't got such a bad reputation in so many ways is because people who were doing it shouldn't have been doing it, right? It's better to have no training than a bad training, right? You do more damage doing work you shouldn't be doing. And then also there's this piece of it of when we talk about dismantling and disrupting racism systemically and institutionally within our own field and association like SIETAR, a first action people can take is to refer the work to people who are already experts, and not ask us to create your curriculum so you can be a false expert, right? Because I mean, all of us have been getting those emails for the last 2-3 weeks, right? We're this company, we've been experts, now we want to be experts in what you're an expert in. Can you lend us a little bit of your expertise? And that in it of itself, while people are well-intentioned, don't understand the power and privilege that comes with that, and that by just challenging that behavior is the first step that people can take to looking at how we dismantle it and disrupt it within our own field. So I have another question for all of you, but before I do, we have about 5 minutes left. People have been asking questions as we've been talking. If anybody has any specific questions they want to ask the panelists, to please put those in now. I also think that we will, I think all of your contact information is on our the event page on the SIETAREU.org website. Yes, we have recorded and it will be on the SIETAR Europa YouTube channel. Earlier, someone posted a question about while there certainly is a surge in people supporting what's happening and wanting to be part of the anti-racist movement. And maybe Juliana, this is a question you can answer, is how do we deal with the counter forces, right? Because part of this uprising is that there is a counter voice that is a strong conservative voice against what we're doing. So how do we deal with that?
I think once I was with Senator Pastor Jesse Jackson, and then someone asked him, how did you survive? It was a hostile environment, the civil rights movement, you have a target in your back. So how did you do it? How did you did not give up? And then he answers, like, well, when you have fire in your breast, you run. When you have fire close to your body, you run. So there was no alternative. We have to keep moving. So I think the idea here is really to work on solidarity, but from the perspective of these people who are affected directly by racism. Understanding that when we talk about race, we have a heterogeneous group in the different categories of race. It's not because you're talking about person of African descent, it's like only one specific group. There are different groups within the people that are African descendants. When you talk about migrations, you have different kinds of migrants. When you talk about Roma, there are many ethnicities in Roma. When you talk about Jews, there are many specific forms of Jews. They express their religion and their identity culturally and religiously. When you talk about Muslims, there are different sorts of Muslims. So do not put us in a box and try to define us. So I think understanding these different layers and these different specific dimensions of the manifestation of racism is a good starting point. So I think against the far right is about, and the rhetoric of this hostile environment is really to stay strong, understand the different dimensions, unifying solidarity, read a lot, understand why we are talking about decolonization. Again, like intersectionality became a buzzword, but do you really know what it takes to decolonize your mind? So I think you have to really bring more internal reflections and from an honest point of view. And I think it's time as well that you work in solidarity with other movements. To be very honest, for example, we as anti-racist feminists, we are very isolated from the mainstream gender movement. I'm having a very honest confidence here. Like, we feel isolated, we feel that we don't have a voice, we feel that gender mainstreaming movement is done by the perspective of the white woman, and we don't have a place. So try to bring us more to the green movement, to the LGBTI movement, try to bring us more to the gender movement, to understand our perspectives and our dimensions. So with that, we can work together and not in silos, because until now, we are as fragmented as the policies are, because fragmentation of policies is also a very good white supremacy strategy. Do not forget, they fragment to separate.
Thank you, Juliana. So we're at the end of our time, but before we close, I'd really like each of you to have a sort of final word, final say, final thought, final takeaway to share before we close. Josie?
I feel that's a big question. I mean, honestly, thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure listening to all of you. It's such a pleasure knowing that you all exist and doing this kind of work. It sounds weird, but it really gives me relief, because I feel like it's so important to understand that this is not a work that one person can do. It's not a work that two people can do, but it's something that we have to do together. And I think it's so important that there are people specialized in different fields, because as I've said, you know, racism is something that is made by human beings, so it can be deconstructed by human beings, and it takes many. So honestly, I'm really thankful to just being here and listening to you as well. It really gives me hope, and I feel empowered by that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie. Farzana?
I want to echo that. This has been such a powerful, moving discussion. Just a couple of things. One thing that I want to leave us with is that and this comes from my work in advocacy with the multiracial community, cultural mixing is not your savior. So this idea that cross-cultural everything or interracial unions, that's the hope forward. I saw a problematic keynote about this, and I just want to say that that puts a lot of pressure on people who are mixed race or in interracial unions, and it's unfair oppression. I also want to uplift the idea of affinity group spaces. These groups that we've been a part of, I founded one, the Practitioners of Color Forum. It was at the SIETAR USA conference for 3 years. It's really important that we continue those spaces and respect those spaces. So invite that dialogue that needs to happen separately. Maybe if there is a white allyship space that could be created, that could be where the work could be done. I just want to recommend that. But continuing that type of work and really being active in the dialogue and not letting this just sit as an intellectual exercise. That was a great webinar. People are giving us a lot of great feedback. But really think about what is next for us. And I think that interrogation of what we know and what we hold true is a first step. And then finding a way to ally ourselves with different community groups is another way. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana. Kelly.
Oh, we need another hour for the things that I gotta say, but let me just say this. First, it was beautiful to see my girl, Josephine. It's been so long since I've seen you. It's so good to see your face. And Farzana, of course, I absolutely adore you. I think you're one of the most brilliant people I know. Tamara, I love you to the moon and back and more. And I have to say, Juliana, we've never met before, but girl, I'm gonna be calling you. So but we got some things to talk about. But I think I'll leave it with this. I'm getting to this point where I am beginning to question the language that we use around ally, advocacy, accomplices, because the problem is not ours. Let's just keep it real. The brown people did not create racism, right? So the problem to be fixed needs to come from white folks. And so I need for them to be the workers, the ones out there that are doing the work. But having said that, that doesn't mean being in front of audiences yet. When I say doing the work, I'm talking about doing your personal internal work, right? What do you know about yourself? What don't you know about yourself? We have to start there. And we have to start with this notion of healing those pains. I talked about a long time that, I think that if it's absolutely true, the generational trauma exists for African Americans, Native Americans, and everybody who's been conquered, colonized, or enslaved. If that's true, that generational trauma exists for us, then what is the equivalence of what happens for the colonizers, the enslavers, or the conquerors, right? So there's got to be something that is in their body that they need to heal, because something broke when you treat other human beings as if they are less than human beings. And so we have to heal that. And I was gonna write a book, but then Natasha Arulaya, our friend who's on this call, she introduced me to My Grandfather's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, I think is his last name, or Menakem. And I love that book because he wrote what I wanted to write. Now, I got some different ways of saying things, so I might still write it, but I think that it is an incredibly powerful book that talks about the healing that we need to do in our bodies as people of color, as white folks, and in particular, like one of the clients I have, the police community. So do your work. Get to work. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. And Iris Wangermans, who's from Germany, said that she's doing that research, and specifically with grandchildren of World War II. So we look forward, Iris, to hearing more about your work. Juliana, final words.
My final words, I'm so grateful for this. I just like gratitude and admiration, and having a strong panel with women of color is the epiphany of my deepest dreams in the field of anti-racism. So all my respect to all the sisters, and I will be following you. You're not alone. I hope I'm not alone either. And Tamara, for you, it's just a great work that you're doing. Thank you for bringing the uncomfortable discussions that are necessary, but you've done it with a very respectful way, in a very careful way. And thank you for creating a safe space for us, because not all the panels are safe space for speakers of color.
Thank you, Juliana, and thanks to each of you for sharing your time, your experience, your wisdom. It means so much to me to have had all of you to launch this series. For everybody who's watching, we had over 200 people here. We still have over 150 people here. This is just the first of a year-long series. Next month, we will have a webinar on whiteness and white fragility with Natasha Arulaya. And we have had lots of members from SIETAR Europa who have stepped up and want to be part of this series. So if you are here and you are listening and you want to be part of this series, please email me at president@sietareu.org with what you would like to share. And I would look forward to these conversations continuing, and hopefully as we continue this series over the next year, we'll have the opportunity to see some or all of you again. So thanks to everybody for joining, and keep an eye out on the SIETAR Europa website for the date and registration for our next event. Thank you, everybody. Okay, let me stop recording.